Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kyle Melatti. I'm originally from Las Vegas, Nevada, but I now study public policy and political science at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina. Today, I have the proud privilege of presenting my research at the Sanford School of Public Policy under Professor Abdullah Antepli on religion and politics in the 2016 election. So, why the particular interest in 2016? Well, it comes without say that the 2016 election was one of the most unusual, wild, and divisive elections in American history. Deciding between Donald J. Trump and Hillary Clinton wound up as a battle of ideology and character not seen in decades. Clinton was entangled with an email scandal, Trump had a slew of controversies from his past and during the campaign, and many were concerned about the state of the country. Clearly, we survived all of that apocalyptic rhetoric, and fate has led us here to this conference, but we can now take the time to step back and look at just exactly what happened in 2016. At the time, I was 16 years old, attending a Catholic high school back home. One of the most interesting aspects of the election that I found was the difference in religious rhetoric around the election, with some of my Catholic teachers coming out in direct support for Trump and many others in direct support for Clinton. I'll talk about this later, but the Catholic Church is very hierarchical. So to me, it was the first time I realized that Catholics don't vote as a monolithic block where divine truth has somehow told us which candidate to pick. Instead, we were faced with what many considered unchristian or not extremely devout options, where one candidate faced opposition from the Pope himself, and the other supported abortion legislation, which is oftentimes a Catholic no-go. Some called it one of the prime paradoxes of the 2016 election. In other words, how could a religious person support a candidate who flaunted adultery or praised Planned Parenthood or admitted to never asking for God's forgiveness? Many faith leaders eventually supported Donald Trump, but they didn't start out by doing so, for example. Ted Cruz appeared to be the original frontrunner on the religious right, but over the course of the election, however, religious and political figures started to give into the idea that Trump would become the nominee on the Republican Party side and Clinton on the Democratic side. And some chose to endorse Trump outright. Others chose to endorse Clinton instead, or to remain silent for the entire election. But that being said, the evolution of choice of candidate on religious grounds begs the question of how religious leaders or individuals made the determination to support a candidate. Now, with my research at the Sanford School, what I really wanted to delve deeper is how religious groups and religious people made that key decision in 2016. Specifically, I wanted to study how religious groups supported or opposed a particular candidate and what went into that calculation when finally in the ballot box. And because we live in what many academics call a tri-faith country, I ended up analyzing Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. As you can see, renowned academic Will Herberg really set the stage for the study of religion in America by making sure that the gold standard for religious study at the national level is to look at these three religious faiths together. Now, I predicted before beginning that religion is increasingly losing its foothold on the American decision maker and voter. Therefore, religious groups and individuals would be way more willing to sacrifice their religious beliefs in order to promote their policy agenda. I also thought that 2016 will be the best example of that yet. So to go about answering my central research question, I thought about the way in which I imagine most voters came to their decision. They plugged in their religious beliefs and their ideology, compared the stakes involved, like what moral sacrifices they were making compared to the reward for a candidate, and then they finally made a decision about which candidate they wanted to support. For some in 2016, this equation was quite easy, but for others this process was quite grueling. What this meant for my research was to look at the historical context of these groups first, then perform what's called stakeholder analysis, and finally analyze the election results. So these are the three traditions that spent the most money for political action committees, lobbying, and direct support of candidates. Needless to say, they're very involved in politics. Demographically, Protestants make up 43% of America, Catholics at 20%, and Judaism at 2%. And Christianity as a whole still makes up roughly 65% of people in the United States as of 2019. These Abrahamic faiths share many political characteristics in common, but they also have many differences. In one, political positions during the 2016 election, two, abilities to affect the political process, and three, their final assessments of the 2016 election. Taking a look at these three major differences, the paper I wrote aimed to analyze what the cost-benefit calculation went into the political decision-making and what stakes were involved for each religious group. Arguably, the oldest influence on American politics is the Protestant tradition. Made up of over 200 denominations in the United States and around 45,000 denominations worldwide, Protestantism traces its American roots back to the very foundation of the country, which is why I'm going to talk about it the most in this presentation. First of all, there's an important distinction between the different types of Protestants, and I acknowledge that. with evangelical Protestants generally more conservative and mainline Protestants generally more liberal. Religious scholar and the author of The Religion and Culture Wars, John Green, did an interview with PBS where he talked about evangelicals, specifically saying, "One belief is that the Bible is inerrant. It was without error in all of its claims about the nature of the world and the nature of God. One would expect, therefore, that the political behavior of such an evangelical person would be to vote in line with the Bible, including the infallibility of things like the Golden Rule or the Beatitudes or any other teachings from Jesus about behavior. Political candidates evangelicals vote for under this premise would have to be the most in line with a Christ-like figure or someone with a Christian character, although they don't necessarily have to be Christian. A good example of this was Ronald Reagan, where Protestants came out in tremendous support for him, even though he had a shaky history with conservatism coming from his background as an actor in California." On the road to Donald Trump, religious historian and truly an expert on Protestantism in the United States, John Fay, wrote the book you can see here called Believe Me, talking about how evangelicals across the country decided that strongman politics was more worthwhile than the older Christian character model. Strongman politics means choosing a political strongman, or sometimes in Christian terminology, a political messiah, to get your policy agenda done. The main reason for that was the big shift that happened in the 20th century, where things like Roe versus Wade, the divorce revolution, the psychology revolution, removal of school prayer, etc., they were all major challenges to the traditional way of life that evangelicals and Protestants knew and loved. All of this made white Christian evangelicals and conservatives partake in what's known as white evangelical fear, which led to finding a political strongman as opposed to a Christ-like figure who could just get the job done no matter the cost. And so we got Jerry Falwell. In the Believe Me book, John Fay talks about how Jerry Falwell Sr. made the political playbook for the religious right, uniting them around issues like abortion and marriage, and putting religious people on a crusade against those that challenged them. Quoting from Fay here, in 1979, Falwell formed the Moral Majority, an organization designed to raise money for conservative politicians and to encourage people of faith to seize power in the federal government, and to rid the country of pornography, abortion, and homosexuality. They fought against communism, socialism, and all forms of big government and sought to restore America to its Christian roots. So the Republican Party and conservatism in this religious way generally blended the separation between being conservative and being religious. I can't emphasize enough the importance of this Jerry Falwell, but don't take my word for it. Just as recently as 2017, the Gospel Herald published an article called "Why Jerry Falwell Sr. is Equally Important as Ronald Reagan to the Republican Party." For the sake of time, I just want to add that Catholicism and Judaism have a much more checkered past in the United States. Neither religion has ever been in the majority in this country. There's been waves of anti-Catholic, anti-Zionistic, and anti-Semitic movements in the country, and Catholics and Jews are also coming from way later waves of immigration in American history than Pilgrims and Protestants. That said, both groups have often pulled above their weight politically. John F. Kennedy was a Catholic president, now Joe Biden as the second in the country. While there have been no Jewish presidents, Chuck Schumer is currently the majority leader in the Senate. Catholic and Jewish businessmen also exert a great deal of political power, with a late Jewish casino owner, and actually my dad's old boss, Sheldon Adelson, donating millions and millions of dollars for his foreign policy agenda, and we'll get back to him as well. And so going into the 2016 election, we had these stances. Obviously, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what stances are at the individual level, but this table reflects my research and academia's understanding of religious groups and religious positions on key issues. This religious context went into each religious voter's decision-making process when in the ballot box in 2016. So just to remind everyone in the audience, the 2016 election truly was a fascinating competition in politics. Here you can see the finalists of Senator Marco Rubio, Trump, and Senator Ted Cruz on the left, and Senator Bernie Sanders and Clinton on the right. Given one's vote as a function of your religious context and assessing the candidates, each voter had to think about how each candidate was going to benefit the country or their lives. They also had to consider the moral, economic, political, and social risks involved in selecting their candidate as opposed to someone else who might do the job differently. So Protestants were super important to the 2016 election, and they continue to be throughout the Trump presidency. John Fay's book from earlier will tell you just how much Trump rallies and Trump's targeting of the religious right really did work. Even Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio were constantly campaigning towards Protestants and evangelicals in order to gain their support. Many of these individuals were working class or lower middle class citizens who had gone through the 2008 financial crisis of the Obama administration and just didn't like what happened. And multiple sources, including Clinton's own election team, will tell you that the Democrats made little to no effort to campaign directly towards evangelical voters. What happened in 2016 was also the best evidence yet of the marriage between religious conservatism and the Republican Party. It was never necessarily the case that being one meant the other. You could be an evangelical and not vote for the Republican Party, although statistically the numbers were always in that direction. No other demographic, though, voted for Trump the same way that evangelicals did in 2016, which has massive implications politically for even the coming years about the importance of the religious right in the Republican Party. For Catholics, the story was nowhere near as dramatic, but it was still interesting. We know the context of pro-life, but Catholics don't always vote that way, and they certainly didn't vote that way in 2016. I was actually surprised, though, to find out that the consensus candidate who received 50% or more of the Catholic vote was Donald Trump. And that's who it was. On the surface, the Catholic Church, including the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, has some pretty conservative views, like being anti-gay marriage or anti-abortion. It seems as though they have been getting increasingly conservative in recent years. And one example is a letter written to Congress formally denouncing Senate Bill 788, the Equality Act, which grants some protections and rights to transgender people. That said, you can see the quote on the screen from Pope Francis, which many pundits thought was calling Trump unsuitable to be president and an indicator for how Catholic Americans should vote. With the Jewish community, you're wound up to paint a different picture depending on if you're talking about Orthodox, Conservative, or Reform Judaism in the United States. That said, some important events that defined the Jewish vote in 2016 were this. Other than Sheldon Adelson and the right-wing Jewish leaders and businessmen, Trump had a bumpy road with the Jewish community. At an event in December 2015, he made a comment about not wanting to take money from Jewish fundraisers and questioned if anyone there didn't want to negotiate a deal. David Duke, the former KKK Grand Wizard, endorsed Trump, and Trump did not initially disavow or condemn David Duke when faced with some Jewish backlash. He held back on condemning anti-Semitic comments against journalist Julia Ioffe, and lastly promoted the American First Agenda, which many saw as American isolationism going back to the 20th century. Shortly after the Ioffe incident, Sheldon Adelson endorsed Trump and began supporting the campaign effort financially, which in the end totaled $82 million in 2016 and $172 million in 2020. So now I wanted to show you a couple of graphics about the religious vote in 2016 in the context of some recent elections. This chart comes from the Pew Research Center, and I want you to pay special attention to the rightmost column, which represents change from 2012 to 2016. As you can see, Protestants, Catholics, and other faiths, unaffiliated, and especially evangelicals, all voted in higher proportions for the Republican candidate than the Democratic candidate compared to 2012. Surprisingly enough, Mormons were 4 points more than Democrats in 2016. So in the end, we come back to the process of how a religious group, or more importantly, a religious individual, made that decision to support a particular candidate, weighing the context of their religion, the stakes involved, and the candidates they had to choose from, and finally selecting that candidate. Protestants predominantly supported Trump, Catholics as well, and Jews voted for Clinton. These groups also donated in numbers really never seen before, with some of the political action committees you can see on the screen. They also argued for issues they cared about, including some key issues that have gone on for decades. No single perfect formula can explain why a religious person voted the way they did, but at the end of the day, voting is a personal choice. But what I want all of you to take away from this research are the following major points. Like I predicted, there is a major disconnect between voting by one's faith and voting by one's political agenda. For evangelicals, voting for Trump was placed above any problems they may have had with his character or background. For Catholics, they are faced between someone denounced by Pope Francis and someone who supports anti-Catholic policies like abortion. And for Jews, even with their positions on Israel and Zionism, they still continue to vote for Democrats who are not the most Zionistic political figures. And even though religiosity in general is on the decline in the country, religion clearly will continue to play a huge role in American politics. There has never been an atheist president in this country's history, and that trend will probably continue well into our lifetimes. So lastly, religion and politics are far more intermingled than the average political commentator will give credit. In many parts of this country, religion continues to be a driving factor in political behavior. That said, religion is not everything. If the average citizen could only choose candidates who align perfectly with the Torah, the Bible, the Quran, they would not be able to vote. The big change, though, is voting for people who are very far away from your religious beliefs. This shift in political behavior is a modern idea where candidates are not choosing how closely they align with the moral figurehead of their religion, but rather how much they are the political figurehead of an ideology. It is important to see the humanity in all those across the political spectrum Every voter made value judgments about what matters most to them, and many of those judgments transcended the strict rules and codes from their religion. I do not make any moral evaluations about the voting habits of any particular religious group. Rather, I hope you are as fascinated about me reconciling the religious vote with non-religious candidates. That concludes my presentation. Thank you for everyone at the Religious Studies Student Organization and for everyone who made this conference possible. God bless.